Wait, mas pada. Okay, this guy.
Okay, so what's the motion we're doing?
The first one.
With the leg.
Yeah.
Capital.
Capital the second. Capital the last one. Divido the third one.
1 to 3, right?
Give you the third.
Yeah.
Then off you go second. Okay, so just doing the draft assumptions. So hello, welcome to the pre-quarterfinals draft rating. My name is Kyle, your chapter round. Family with me are.
Hi, my name is Emma.
Hello, just Alright. Well, you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Diana. I'm going first and then last.
My name is Ryan. I'll be going second.
My name is Sid. I'll be going first.
Who's going to play?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Opposition.
Arjun, I'm going first. He pronouns.
I'm joining. I'm going second and then five.
Uma will be speaking third. I see it.
Alright, thank you. So the votings, we're being live stream or recorded? Live stream. The votings consented. Go, you guys consent?
Yeah.
Off?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you guys know the rules. Just make sure to state your direct reference as well. Then I'll do this signing after. Okay, so let's start. Yeah.
Can I be clearly heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Political dynasties are the forebringers of the destruction of a democracy, of a healthy democracy in a budding nation. A few pieces to set up before moving on to two of my substantives. First, what do you define as a political dynasty? I think, as said in the motion info slide, it looks like the Duterte families in the Philippines, the Lee family in Singapore. Firstly, they are oftentimes like generational founders of the country from the start of independence, and many of them run for the country insofar as they can rely on rhetoric of nostalgia of the past. Secondly, there have oftentimes not has been a significant transfer of power between political dynasties or other candidates in the running for election, between the ruling party to a competing political party or competing political candidate since the inception of democracy, right? But secondly, we think this happens exclusively in developing democracies, where we characterize developing democracies or like developing countries as countries with weak democratic norms and with a high propensity towards political corruption and a weak framework of criticism towards the ruling political dynasty or political rulers, right? Third, what do we mean by significantly limit? It means having putting a quota of people coming from political dynasties to compete in your elections. Number one, we think this decreases the presence of political dynasties, necessarily decreasing the airtime and the amount of the megaphone that these people have in order to entrench their beliefs. Secondly, it leads to more competition in the way in which we diversify the political climate and having more airtime for opposing views for people to buy into them. Framing. I think the only reason why this motion exists in the first place is because these political dynasties have constantly dominated elections, have constantly dominated the ruling seat of the country, right? It is likely also to win because number one of the rhetoric of how, for example, the Lee family uses the independence of Singapore and the greatness of like the Lee Kuan Yew as a way in which people vote for him. Or secondly, race-based rhetoric like Mahathir uses Malay like supremacy as a way of entrenching his votes, right? Our burden in this debate is simple. We want to protect the long-term development of a healthy democratic norm. And we think this takes opposition at their best case, in which we prevent intergenerational harm of weak structures of democratic systems, insofar as these political dynasties can entrench their power. So moving on to my first argument, right? As to how we persistently dominant political dynasties structurally weaken democratic norms. Three layers here. First, within the ruling elite, or like the political dynasties have created an ecosystem of power that entrenches their rule. Because since the inception of democracy, right, number one, they are able to secure incredibly wealthy donors to fund their campaigns, insofar as they have like a deep, like rooted tie and connections within like the political ecosystem of like governmental servants, right? I think this is like number two, financial contracts so that people can remain in their good favor. But thirdly, the rhetoric and nostalgia of like remembering the past, the how independence was founded, like how the Lee family uses the independence through Lee Kuan Yew in order to incentivize voters to vote. Like if you're truly a Singaporean, vote for us, right? That is how exactly they get elected into office. But I think prolonged periods of, I'll tell you later, prolonged periods of ruling political dynasties conflate the dynasties with the state itself, and that's incredibly harmful. We think in the developing state, countries go through a period of economic growth, and we think long-standing political rulers are able to assign that form of growth to the dynasties that they belong to, right? This, number one, creates an uneven playing field insofar as they can take credit for all the things that the country has gone through. We think this, like any other political candidate, does not stand a chance. But secondly, we think this entrenches a cult of personality with these political dynasties who have dominated their ruling power, which is oftentimes race-based insofar as the political dynasty is made up of, for example, Malays or like Chinese or something like that, right? But thirdly, we think the harms are like simple, right? We think there's no culture of healthy democratic accountability being formed in a developing state. Because number one, we think the consistent practice of exchanging powers is a healthy sign of democracy which is absent and under the side of opposition. Where we think transitioning to a functional democracy, you need significant amounts of competition and not a political dynasty to actually win all your elections, right? I think this leads to political apathy, right? When people see like political dynasties dominating all of these like elections one after the other, we think voters need to collectively believe that changes are possible, but in the status quo, it isn't for many countries, right? When political dynasties exist, we think the comparative is that when we actually allow competition and allow more people to enter enter the election, we think this creates a strong culture of scrutinizing and like the political dynasties and actually holding these institutions accountable. We think this also leads to better competition insofar as these policies can be better brought forth and be better and have better policies put forth to the table insofar as there are more options available to voters to choose, right? We think this also leads to a propensity towards corruption because I think in status quo there are weak check and balances against like political dynasties like using the government's money or entrenching political relationships so that they can get some more like get rich, right? I think that's taking them like in a majority of cases in which this does happen in countries, right? And we think there's no check and balance insofar as they're the ruling government. So what is the comparative under our side? Yeah, I'll get you.
So what's the difference between an influential wealthy leader who uses race-based politics, i.e. Mandela and the ANC, with the Duterte family?
The scale of harm is far different, right? Firstly, like this rich person probably doesn't have generational like relationships and like entrenched power since the inception of democracy for these political dynasty. Dynasties normally have immense amounts of billions of dollars, and like even the name behind that dynasty is nostalgic in of itself to make people incentivized to vote for them just for the sake of nostalgia, right? I think the scale is far different. So second argument here is how we lead to a healthy and diverse political climate. I think two things. Firstly, diversify the political climate. My timer, I can't see the timer, just clap when it's done, okay? We think this leads to more airtime being given to more candidates in the election, right? This means, number one, other candidates likely become energized and more competitive to elevate political competition. We think this leads to, number one, more representative policies. For example, political dynasties tend to be race-based. That is how they entrench their power. For example, catering to majority races. We think this is like how Mahathir and Barisan Nasional entrenched Malay supremacist policies through Bumiputra policies. We think now this actively led to political apathy amongst other races, right? But I think the comparative is simple. That when we allow more competition, we allow for more diverse like array of politicians coming into the circuit and allowing voters to feel energized, people who were initially disenfranchised to actually vote and make changes for the country. I think that's the start of a good, healthy of democracy, of transitioning to a functioning democracy instead of one that's dominated by one race. I think this also leads to better policies insofar as, like, for example, they have to actually like table good policies for them to win because of the fact they don't have the name behind them, and they can't rely on the dynasty to actually win in elections. So I think if you want to vote for accountable and actual healthy democracy with like good democratic norms, I think you should side by side proposition.
Hi, thank you so much, Kia. Hello, you good.
Okay, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. The glaring failure of this government team is that most of their outcomes are assertive, because at not one point in the Prime Minister's speech did they explain why when you disempower the dynasty, that you won't get persistent political parties that continue to be elected cycle after cycle, insofar as they can't explain why you'll have this healthy form of competition on their side, and you won't have a persistent political party that comes to rule cycle after cycle, they can't take today's debate. But before I get into further responses, first of all, what do we support on the side of opposition? 3 things. 1, I'd like to contextualize what these democracies actually look like in developing countries. Because note, the rise of political dynasties within these areas was a product of people's votes. So they've enabled these families to rise as a result of electing them in successive cycles. So there's an express preference on behalf of voters to have these families be the ones leading the political system because they trust them, they feel that they best represent them, and that's why they ought to be in power. Secondly, we wouldn't place any limitations on who can run for office. So insofar as these dynasties meet the basic requirements to run for office, we'll let them run. Lastly, what are the democratic check and balances we can have on our side? So assuming Gov has fiat to do things like institute quotas, restrict the speech of these individuals, we think we can reallocate it to some mechanisms. This could include increasing the political literacy of the voter base to empower voters, process, strengthening the election commission to ensure we can have fair and free elections, and even doing things like removing censorship laws so we can create a culture of free speech when it comes to running for elections. Into responses them, firstly, on their setup, they want to have a quota system, but I don't think this is enough for them to claim their benefit, because if Duterte can still be the single person to fill up the quota you allocate to him, he can still have overt influence in the Philippine election, and I don't think that is enough. You'll have to specify who can and cannot run in this election, and you need to single out those members of the political dynasty and exclude them from running altogether. You can't just have a quota system. But secondly, if you actually wanted to suppress the influence these individuals have, you need to deplatform these dynasties. Don't give them any ability to speak out, because if you argue that they have so much influence in this democracy, you cannot allow their speech to have any form of influence whatsoever. I think this is anti-democratic and not democratic as what Proposition 1 wanted to point to you. But they then have two arguments. The first is that it structurally weakens democracies. They say an ecosystem of power exists. The issue is that, note that donations and funding is integral to any election. So if they argue that funding is what corrupts these elections, you are going to have to limit that on your side of the house. But look, they don't exactly distinguish what is the difference between a dynasty and a political party that constantly gets into power. Because if one party constantly gets into power on their side of the house, for example, let's use Barisan Nasional as they wanted to bring, would they break up these parties if they were the ones who were threatening the system? Government is actually forcefully engineering the system on their side to engineer a competition when it's not actually representative of the people's will. The last thing they say is that it's a cult of personality, but I'd actually like to flip this against them, because what this does is it forces the successors of these dynasties to live up to the past image. If you aren't as good as the image that Lee Kuan Yew set, you will get kicked out of power, and we are seeing that happen in Singapore now when the Workers' Party, election after election, has gained far more traction. The second argument is that you create a healthy democracy. One, they say that there's more airtime, but the issue is if they argue money equals speech, the richest candidates will still get the most airtime on their side. The second thing they say is that you cater to more individuals. But no, political dynasties are reflective of the will of the people. So they're not explaining why the preferences of individuals will change on their side to vote for individuals who are outside of these political dynasties, if these dynasties can still do things like nominate their successors and tell the public you should vote for this candidate. Two arguments in this speech. One, as to how we think on the principle why it's legitimate for these dynasties to exist and fully participate within the democracy, and secondly, the practical harms when you want to limit these dynasties from participating. On the first argument, three parts. One, I like to characterize what led to the formation of these dynasties to begin with. We need to assume this is a decent democracy at the very least, and not a broken one as what government wants to characterize to. The reason behind this is that dynasties don't form overnight. You needed to build the trust of the people in order to get them to vote for you. So what does this look like? These are families responsible for creating years of prosperity. For instance, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, who had to build the country from the ground up after Malaysia kicked him out. So the majority of the voter bloc elects these dynasties, not because they feel that they're great, but because they feel secure. They feel that they can trust these dynasties because they're the only one who got them out of the darkest of times. Secondly, why is it just legitimate for individuals to vote for these dynasties? No, it's inherent to a functioning democracy that you have the ability to vote for the individual you trust the most. That is why identity politics is so popular, because individuals vote for members of the same race because they believe they can represent them best. But I just like to posit to government, what is the difference between a strong political party and a dynasty if you both can exert strong levels of influence? Because if they argue that having influence in a democracy is bad because then you can get the majority of the vote, you would have to break up parties which consistently get into power, because that is subverting competition in the election. But the final thing is, I think voting on past precedents for many individuals is the best choice they have, because when the future is bleak and the only form of security you have is when you can rely on a dynasty which is a track record of success, that is a legitimate choice. But finally, why is it important to respect democratic principles in a nascent democracy? Because the issue is, many people don't have trust to immediately ascribe to the government, because previously they were led by colonizers who ruled very autocratically. When you overhauled the system and instituted a democracy, it came with the promise that you let anyone run for election. But the issue is that you're going against this promise on the side of government when you betray that promise and you say that no, you can't run for election because you come from a dynasty and you're going to screw up the system. Before I go on to the second argument, sure, what's your point?
Political dynasties oftentimes came to power not through democracy, but when these countries were founded upon independence itself. Competition never existed, and these kinds of powers were already entrenched to begin with. So the vote was never important.
Okay, so the issue is that these were the only individuals who actually bothered taking the effort to unite the country and gain independence. If you are saying we shouldn't let independence leaders run for election because they have to too much influence, I feel like just anti-democratic and antithetical to the principle Prop wants to run. Second argument, on the principal harms of eliminating these political dynasties. One, how these dynasties react to the policy. And note, this takes up at their best case where these dynasties are malevolent. It doesn't mean that if you limit them from running from power, they won't find other ways to exert their influence. One, they can fund proxies where you can still exert their influence. Two, you can nominate their own successors. These don't have to be from the family, but you can still benefit by association. For example, Lee Kuan Yew can say, vote for this guy, I trust him, and the voters will follow. But last, in the worst case, they do things like sabotage the democracy. So they resort to corrupting the systems on power on prop if they're so greedy for power. Comparatively, when you force them to compete transparently in the open, where all their actions are visible, then it's far easier to call them out. Finally, political capital on prop is squandered. When you have trust in the system, but you break it under the model, we think that is when you don't get participation. That is when you get apathy, because when individuals feel that the candidates running don't represent them, they feel it's no point voting. If you actually wanted participation in democracy and stability, you could only go with the op I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Right? It's like right. Yeah, go ahead.
Why is the table so wet? Starting in 3, 2, 1. Politics is a game of resources. The dominance of political dynasties has led to the submission of oppositional parties that manifest a political climate of consistently banking our trust in these political dynasties blindly. They create a status quo of blindly voting on these political parties, and they corrupt the developing democracies. Arjun claims that we failed when we do not stop persistently dominant political parties, but seriously, our policy literally deals with that initially. Like, if they're dominant, they clearly will just break them apart. I don't get what's the fatal mistake they claim here. Two things then I'll be talking about. Firstly, on democratic norms, and secondly, on political environments, which deals about competition. So firstly then, on democratic norms and why they're so important. Because realize then, in political dynasties, these are political parties in which have trust from these voters for generational years. And this is not just the trust that you get initially from elections, but it is the bias that has happened and formed and has manifested through the decades of years that you've been in power. And this causes an unequal election, especially when you have biases all over in the country in these developing democracies as well, which causes them to be like unequally dominant. But secondly, it's about democratic accountability, especially in these developing democracies. And this is something that's hindered under their side of the house. Why then is this dominance something that's actually so harmful? Because realize that the dominance of these political dynasties creates less incentives for oppositional parties to compete in these elections. No, thank you. This is exactly why it ruins for capacity for voters to actually be more open-minded, because realize that they have generational biases towards these political dynasties, and that's the reason why oppositional parties lose out their opportunity to even campaign for the interests and the nuanced policies that cater towards the interests of these individuals. And realize that this lessens the capability for citizens on the ground and people on the ground to just make informed choices to vote for these other parties. No, thank you. Then this also causes them to like always believe that these political dynasties are something that's in their interest, especially when there's generational bias. Arjun then claims that individuals have placed trust in these political dynasties initially, but realize that this trust is not from something that's on a natural election, because this is trust that's been happening for generational years, where it has been happening for decades, and this is a trust in which has been already harmful, because this is not something that caters towards interest, but rather it is a trust of bias. They conveniently attempted to frame this debate by claiming that these political dynasties happen because of people's interest, but this is not something that's happening in the status quo because of the generational bias that they happen. They completely dismiss the important framing from Liana that these political parties are trusted, are quote unquote trusted by individuals on the ground just because they've been dominated, and that is not the trust that we want in these elections. Secondly, then on political environments, and I just want to note that the reason why competition is important is because of the political nuance that you get on your side of the house, especially when there's oppositional parties that have the incentive to create more nuanced policies to cater as to many individuals as possible to be able to win these dominant parties, especially with our policy on our side when we break up these political dynasties. But secondly, that competition exists exclusively under our end, especially on their side when their policy doesn't necessarily deal with the bias that has been happening generationally over decades. It is unclear to me why they have quality votes and why interests are met when dominant parties have generational bias in these developing democracies, especially when they're still developing. It is unclear to me why they have nuanced policies when there's not much competition, especially when these parties know that there's the generational bias and they have no incentive to actually cater towards the interest when they already know that these bias exist in the status quo. And note, as a citizen as well, they also can't just try to hold them accountable, especially when they have millions of individuals around these nations as well, and this ruins the democratic accountability as well. Opposition parties themselves have no incentive, and this creates a cycle of failure, especially when citizens do not know the potential that these parties hold, and when these oppositional parties have no chance at even being held in these campaigns initially. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
So I think we'd like to remind you to reread the motion where you can only ban political dynasties and limit them, not that you can ban all dominant political parties and only allow the opposition groups to run.
Even if these political, persistently dominant parties still exist, it is the fact that political dynasties are also part of these dominant parties initially. So insofar as we're just adding an additional layer of banning another type of dominant party in the status quo, that's a lot better than your counterfactual on your end then. Moving on to my argument on how this policy meaningfully and categorically empowers the votes of individuals on the ground. 3 layers then. Firstly, voters become politically apathetic under a dominant party due to the lack of change. That is to say, there's growing discontent among the people. Decades of political failure to literally spearhead successful change leads to disillusionment in voters. Not only do community leaders face activist fatigue, but hot button issues then provide political momentum for brief periods of time will be exhausted once voters have been desensitized. All societies facing as an example, all societies facing COVID-19 will actually punish or reward their governments depending if they actually deal with the problem. But now in the status quo, those ones in 2022, they don't even have hold their own governments accountable for failures of the state protecting the healthcare of society. As they continue to lose even the most worrying of state failures, it is the fact that oppositional movements lose traction and supporters begin to believe that change is impossible under their side of the house. But second layer, we encourage voters to literally disperse political loyalties into independently deserving political candidates, because realize that majority of political factions is forced to break up and distinguish themselves from one another. Even a party loyalist will face a problem when they are moved out of the party themselves, or if there are more parties that could actually represent the original political leanings towards their end. But this also creates more viable options for the people on the ground, and this creates a conducive political environment where voters are less partisan, and this is far more likely to evaluate the variety of candidates in our side of the house, which creates more valuable elections in these nations and better helps with these developing democracies. And this closely represents their deeply held beliefs, which is why it is so beneficial for these voters on the ground. But last layer is on diverse political competition, where it actually drives better political consciousness among voters. That is to say, the existence of a limitation causes voters to consider those who are viable contenders and disperse votes across party lines, and as well as take up an active political interest in alternate candidates as well in these elections themselves. The reason why breaking up these political parties are so beneficial is because we take down these echo chambers that have been happening generationally. But not only that, we encourage these voters to engage in an open-minded political discourse over then a counterfactual of just predetermined blind faith voting for these political dynasties where it has been generationally proven that these individuals are biased towards these places. We create competition and we allow these voters to make make more informed choices, which is why the elections and democracy is far better for these developing democracies under our side of the house. For all those reasons, we allow for choice and we make change. Choose proposition.
All right, thank you so much for that speech, DPM. Dear Logan, go ahead.
If an American liberal can vote for Biden, not because he truly believes in him, but because he believes that Biden is the only realistic competition to Trump, then opposition would argue it's legitimate to vote for a dynasty. Opposition characterizes that representative democracies are built on character, are built on rhetoric, and are built on identity politics because that is what the people want, and that is what voters feel most represented by. Proposition hasn't told us why it's legitimate to limit democracies and the autonomous choice of voters in that manner. We're very proud to oppose. Firstly, I'm going to deal with the mechanism from Proposition and their characterization of what a political dynasty entails, and then I'm going to talk about two issues wherein I'll integrate my third extension coming out from my speech. Firstly then, let's deal with the characterization of political dynasties in two ways. Number one, we would note that the characterization of political dynasties on Proposition isn't unique only to political dynasties. What do they tell you? They tell you that political dynasties look like two things. Firstly, that they rely on the rhetoric of nostalgia, on race-based politics that builds a cult of personality. That isn't inherent to a political dynasty. Mandela can run on a platform of race-based politics. Trump runs on a platform of identity politics, and he's built on nostalgia, going back to when America was better in the past, going back to my wealth as an individual businessman. These are all individuals and actors that leverage off the mechanisms Proposition says are apparently so harmful and so exclusive to political dynasties. Secondly, they tell you about a pool of generational wealth and resources. I think these are nothing more than the marks of a wealthy and healthy political party. The Democratic Party can have hundreds and millions of dollars to spend. Any large political party is bound to have lots of wealth. It's unclear as to why that's unique to you being a political dynasty. Why is this harmful then? Firstly, we would just remind second Proposition of their burden that you can't literally deal with it because the motion says you can only ban political dynasties. And it's unclear that their response is correct. It's not merely a small extension of their policy, but rather it is a massive overstretch of their Proposition fiat. Dynasties don't populate like rabbits. We would say at most, maybe half a dozen senators are from that dynasty, which means that they're not massive material impacts if all you're talking about is resources, if the resources are going to be there either ways. The biggest impact, therefore, is the impediment on the principles of democracy, where individuals who actually wanted to vote for the people don't get that vote because you hampered it and you significantly reduced their influence on their side. What are the harms of this generic characterization from Proposition in two ways? One, because they fail to delineate why voting for a political dynasty from voting for other political parties. And this means they don't delineate why voting for a political dynasty can be a legitimate democratic decision, meaning that if Proposition truly cared about democracy, then their policy is the one that's infringing on the right to democracy and the right to choice. But secondly, it doesn't necessarily prove why these characterizations lead to the harms that they talk about. So what are the harms of their characterization? We would note that all of those harms are detached from their mechanisms and thus not mutually exclusive. What does this mean in two ways? One, that if their harm was criminals in positions of power, we're more than happy to bar indicted individuals from running. That is not part of this debate. You don't have to be part of a political dynasty to commit a crime. But secondly, if they're telling you about how at its conception, the establishment of these leaders was undemocratic, we would note that one, actually that's untrue because independent leaders must often be the most unifying actors in the country. Nobody's going to take up arms and follow a leader if they don't respect them and unify under their rule. So it means they're probably the most representative. But even if they were not representative, voting for someone based on their past track record is nothing more than a healthy democracy. In a representative democracy, you can never be sure that the person you vote into power will genuinely respect you and vote for your needs. What if you vote them into power and they completely backstab on your policies? It's unclear. But what you can be sure is their trust, their track record. Everybody votes on politicians based on how they perform in the past. And so using the past as an example and a justification for voting is really not the harm that they want to talk about. But lastly, we will note that race-based politics are endemic to the system and they would exist anyway because that's what the people want, that's what happens in the kinds of democracies that you're talking about. Two issues then in this speech. Firstly, on the principles of democracy and political accountability in two ways. One, notice that political accountability is contingent on political participation. There's no point in banning these parties and then these individuals feeling as if they're not represented and therefore not going to the election booths, because that means they're still not going to be represented. There's still no accountability. If proposition doesn't explain why you cannot genuinely opt into political dynasties, we would posit that cutting them out from elections altogether means that individuals just don't go to vote because they don't see the people that represents them the best. I.e., if the first proposition talks about a cult of personality existing, it would exist either ways. The difference is whether or not you allow these individuals to express their preferences in that vote. But secondly, we think you're actually going to hold them to a higher level of accountability because of the kinds of past precedents. As my first speaker told you, there's a history that you have to uphold. There's a legacy you have to respect. The moment you fail on that respect, there's a healthy democracy which we encourage with our symmetric opposition fiat, which means that when you fail as a political dynasty, opposition parties rise to fill the gap. That is the mark of a healthy democracy which we enforce under our model that is still unresponded to. But secondly, on the idea of the long-term development for the nations then, we would note that this happens in two ways. One, we think there's the political stability and cooperation that exists under our SAPpy house. We would note that our model can also be more harm than good, given that proposition has a very subjective model and a subjective system that makes it more subject to abuse and manipulation. What does this look like? I think we need to look into the nuances of the ban that you're talking about. Do you ban the head of the family only? Do you ban their cousins and their children? What is the level of the ban you go into? Does a stronger political dynasty get more seats because they're more influential, or do they get less seats because that means they have more power and therefore they are more entrenched? All of these are questions that are subjective that proposition doesn't have an answer to, but that means the commission on their side has to answer to all of these subjective questions. That means it's more subject to abuse insofar as it's okay to justify all these subjective decisions made by these committees, and we think it's easier to hold them accountable when it's literally the law. When you commit corruption, we hold you accountable. That's easier to regulate. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
I think your side is far more unrepresentative, given that people are politically apathetic, given that they know political dynasties will win. How do you win on representation?
Or rather, the political dynasties win because people care about them and trust in their ability to rule the government. People are empowered under our SAPpy house because we told you we have a healthy democracy. Or rather, opposition fiat allows us to have some level of transparency. If people continue to vote in political dynasties, then they are there for a reason, because they trust them for stability. Lastly, on how this leads to better economic development in terms of a long-term cohesive political strategy, I think this best enables the sustainable development of the country insofar as the possibility of your political policy outlasting the brief election cycles means that you're able to establish long-term things that establishes your legacy for the long run. As opposed to, for instance, on proposition, they have to live within election cycles because you're constantly going to be kicked out of power the moment you gain any form of resource and traction. This takes proposition at their best. Let's say proposition manages to break the massive political party that's somehow overarchingly messing up democracy. The 70% of the parliament was crucial in order to passing these policies. On proposition, if they don't have this overwhelming influence, they lack the ability to pass any meaningful policies when there's gridlock in the Senate. It's impossible for them to get sustainable development.
Alright, let's switch yellow. Parliamentary, you can go ahead.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Political dynasties denies a healthy democracy. It creates a norm where there is an aura of demanded respect that causes voters to vote out of the norm of doing so because they so-called founded your country. We tell you that on our side, voters are politically conscious. Opposition parties make better policies because they want to live up to those like the reputation that political dynasties have set. So therefore, on outside the house, you have better, more nuanced policies that are being passed. Right? We tell you that voters on outside the house know how to make decisions, and they're most likely going to make more informed decisions that best represent their party and benefits them. Before I move on to clashes, let's just do a little bit of framing, right? Because our case never relied on political dynasties like being benevolent. Even if political dynasties are benevolent, our case still works either way. The fact is that like this destroys democratic choice of voters, right? On your side, you want democracy, but voters don't even have that democratic choice in the first place. You discourage competition on the other side of the house because people know that political dynasties are going to win. There's no means to vote for anyone else if these political dynasties will still continue to take power in the first place, right? We tell you it entrench a generational harm of weak democratic structures where like parties in the future can exploit these weak democratic structures anyway in the first place, right? We tell that opposition cannot guarantee that future political leaders from political dynasties will be benevolent in the first place, which means that all of their like policies they want to pass most likely going to be harmful in that circumstance, right? We say that on the other side of the house, it's a lot more easier for things like corruption to happen, for harms to manifest, right? Our counterfactual is that competition exists. Opposition parties will want to live up to their political dynasty reputation. So therefore, you have more nuanced policies being passed. You have more better policies that benefit those voters on the ground, and voters don't vote just because political dynasties are so famous and well known, right? But then moving on to clashes, then, right? We tell you that there are two main clashes in this debate. The first is what is the incentive of voters, and the second is which side helps transition into a healthy democracy for developing countries. Moving on to the first clash then. Opposition says that voters have voted for these like political dynasties in the first place because they trust them so much, they care about them, and therefore like these voters should have the right to vote for these parties, right? We tell you that on Gov, we tell you three things. First of all, political dynasties have years of reputation, which means that most of their like line of work comes from the fact that they so-called founded the party, so people have to like trust them in the first place, right? We tell you that they vote not because their policies are good, they vote because they are biased towards political dynasties, because they have been known for generations, and they have years of influence, they have so much power and resources. It's so easy for them to just continue to go into elections and win because like voters are still completely biased towards them because they so-called founded your country, right? We tell you that like it doesn't necessarily represent the people on the ground because like voters only vote for these parties. Like on outside the house, voters vote for parties that best represent them because there's things like competition. Parties want to like pull out policies that are best and well explained, and they care about the country as a whole, and voters will know that on the outside of the house. They say it's justified because like voters should be allowed to vote and if like political dynasties should be allowed to speak out. We say this is untrue, right? It's not justified because of several reasons. Firstly, voters are not represented, right? We say that, for example, those that are racially like a minority, for example, on the outside of the house, political dynasties, unless they're going to cater towards them, which means that these races and these parties are not going to get represented in their work, which means that they aren't able to like vote for any sort of change because they are politically apathetic, right? Which means that even if people want to vote for them, right, you cater they don't cater for people who are disenfranchised, and these political parties like dynasties will win, and people like who vote for them are most likely going to be unrepresented, and like it's very unstable under that side of the house. Before I move on to the second clash, yeah, sure.
So if political dynasties were so benevolent, they would encourage competition and still be the better option. So why isn't it legitimate to vote on character and not the complex economic jargon of a policy you can't even understand?
Because on our side of the house, there are many sort of political like parties that could literally come out, which therefore means when you increase the competition, the quality of the policies that you pass need to be significantly better so you can get voted into power in the first place. The thing under your side of the house is that political dynasties continue to get voted into power because they are famous, because they so-called founded your party. Voters vote for them not because the policies are good, but because they have such a good reputation and a good image that it's very easy for voters to just vote because they don't know much about it, right? They just vote out of the fact that they're like a good representation of that so-called party, which is untrue in the first place, right? Moving on to the second clash then about how which side helps transition into a healthy democracy for developing countries. And I think this is the clash that opposition loses out on because they talk about how to get democracy, but it's unhealthy in the first place, right? On the other side, they talk about how people want to vote for a secure party, and that governments will care about these people because in the first place they founded this country and therefore they know a lot about this sort of stuff, right? On government, I tell you three things. Firstly, democracy is only healthy when there is a change in the ruling party, right? Voters need to know that these political parties and these rulers can be held accountable for their actions, and that these political parties can change. There are consequences for things that are not being done right, and therefore, instead of political dynasties continue to get voted into power, right? It means that voters will know that there's more options to vote for in the first place, and that they can vote for a party that best represents their ideas and their norms, right? We tell you that when they say that these parties bothered to take independence in the first place, therefore it's so important. We tell you this is untrue because of several reasons. They talk about how on their side these political dynasties deserved it because they even bothered and cared to start to help the country in the first place. Note panel that on their side of the house, because they have such a good image, it's very easy for them to vote to pass policies that aren't even that beneficial, or it's very easy for them to get corrupt because these policies that they pass might not even be catered towards those people on the ground, but because they so-called founded the country, then voters feel inclined and coerced to vote towards these parties in the first place. Which means that you're already having politically apathetic voters who only vote because of the so-called good image we talk about, right? We tell it on the outside of the house, accountability is being held because, for example, voters are being able to vote for parties that best represent their ideologies. There's a high level of competition, which means that the policies being passed a lot more well elaborated. And note that in a developing country, right, these democracies are so-called unstable on the outside of the house, which is very easy for people to be voted and coerced into voting for a party that does not best represent them. What is our comparison then, and what exactly is our world better? We tell you that we limit people from political dynasties to run for elections, right? We allow more people to come in, and more people who might have better ideologies to come in and run for elections. You have much more diverse and many potential candidates that breaks up a dominant political party that entrenches democracy, right? We tell you that because of higher competition, you vote for the best candidate, not the ones that have the best influence. We allow voters to have the right to agency, and voting for a party that best represents their views, we opt for political parties that best cater towards minorities and disenfranchised people, because they are the ones who have to care about these people on the ground, not the so-called political dynasties that opposition tries to propose. We tell you that because they're not widely known, they have the objective and the goal of trying to pass policies that make them the best suitable candidate for voters to vote for them. So if you want to opt for a side where democracy is a healthy democracy, where future parties in that developing nation is able to vote for a party that best represents them, you should vote for the side of proposition. Thank you.
Alright, thank you so much for that speech starter clip. All right, go ahead.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Lustration was exported throughout Latin America and Asia in the latter half of the last century under the guise of liberation and democracy, only to bring forth chaos and inequality. So purging the leaders in the attempt to build our state has never worked and never will, and government generates a degree of harm that has never been seen within these countries. There are two crucial clarifications I want to make clear at the top of this speech. First is pointing attention to the glaring lack of clarity from this team, because they refuse to explain from all three speakers to what extent do they draw the line when trying to crack down on these large parties. Because we were very clear on our setup about how things like wanting to ensure more democratic practices weren't exclusive to their side, because the formation of a committee that could decide who was likely to be these dynasties, to what extent can we limit their power, and how should we punish them, were also political capital that could exist on our side. So the removal of media censorship, the removal of academic restrictions, and the ability for you to have a fair system when you remove these types of policies and institute new ones that uphold democracy weren't exclusive to their side. So the problem-solution mismatch still extends until their third speaker, which means that in theory, their case was not pro-democracy, it was just anti-any person who has power. So on their side, they have to limit a far greater amount of people from participating in the political system at all. That's why it was highly unnuanced. And this observation is important because it hangs their entire case on we are able to create a fair oppositional party that's able to challenge current norms, and we explain why this is not true, that we already win the round. The second is, I want to reinforce the framing from both op speakers about why their convenient worst case was the most dictatorial leaders and why it won't work. Because first, as LO explains to no response, malevolent politicians will still find ways to subvert your democracy independent of this policy. They attack Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They bankroll proxies that also have the same ideologies as them. Let's take them at their absolute best here. Let's assume this is symmetric. The reason as to why it's worse on their side is because you do it outside of the political system. You don't let them do the same form of challenging that exists when they can challenge each other within the parliament. Where you force them out of the political system entirely, that's when it's less transparent. So assuming it exists on both sides, they generate a new harm by making these types of political challenges outside of our conventional system. But two, note the debate was not retrospective, because all of the corruption identified by this prop team still happens. The bribery, the censorship, the lobbying exists. And the intuition for this is because this happens in the rise before they become a dynasty. So the debate was not about removing the vices of the past, but how about we deal with it in the future, given the current standing position that these parties have power. So they are able to get rid of all of that, and that's why our policy and our setup still functions. Three issues in this speech. First on the democratic principle, second on political instability, and third on the economic prospects. First on the principle. For a team that hinged their case on the glory of democracy, they managed to spectacularly violate it in every way possible. Because what we explained was that large parties were a natural and inevitable byproduct of a democratic system, because that was due to access of wealth or the political ideologies that you stand for. They are arbitrary to your conditions. So if they wanted complete equity, they would have to do a lot more than have just some parties be kicked out of the system and they have to rehaul it entirely. So it's unclear why things like identity-based politics and voting on the basis of race is illegitimate, because if it's meant to maximize autonomy and participation, this is the way they maximize their benefits. They wanted to defend democracy, but any form of majority support on their side is considered democracy. So it's about extent of how we utilize that majority support, and then your side need to break it down. If Varun Rajendran was elected as chairman of the Communist Party, now on your side you have to remove him from that position of power. So people who currently support him have their current representative knocked out of the system entirely. This means a massive amount of people are left unrepresented. And if your side wants to prioritize the minority, that's when you create a more unstable system, because the people who are most represented are kicked out of the system entirely. So if they want to claim that this person may be manipulative, you can never ascertain if each individual's voter preferences were for the person or not. Maybe you like Varun for his policies, maybe you like him for his individual character, but since you never know about what these people actually prioritize, that's why a blanket ban on everyone is unfair and illegitimate. What's the weighing for this? First, this Gov team asserts a lot of random impacts, but all of them are ultimately tied down to whether the democratic principle works, which we explain fails on their side. But two, is about how you increase buy-in for your most nascent democracies, where it's already resistant to adopting its full extent. Now they reduce it further because you remove the very people that represented them. The second thing I want to talk about is political stability and crisis. Let's take them at their best possible grounds. These powers have these parties have overwhelming power, and there's no competition. Let's get exactly what's precisely worse on their side. That's when you get things like policy gridlock within the Malaysian hung parliament, because people can never agree on how do we do this. So that's why you fractionalize into multiple parties. Kate says they are opposition parties, but they don't actually prove why these opposition parties will be effective in representing many people. So you can't claim at first that there are no opposition parties and later on there will be, because they can't say they'll just form a coalition. Because you know what a coalition looks like? It looks like a group of people that have huge amounts of power. So it sounds awfully a lot like your side. It sounds awfully a lot like a dominant power if you want your opposition parties to have these form of coalitions. So even in their best case, this doesn't work, and that's why you have a split political system that can never function. But two, they claim that people are apathetic. They are more likely to be apathetic for other reasons, such as gerrymandering and geographical immobility, which are independent of political dynasties. We solve it to structural reform of the democratic system. In fact, I'm going to flip their claim on competition. We incentivize them to be more effective because they are beholden to the previous legacy of the dynasties before them. Sure.
If political dynasties are limited on our side and society is still politically leaning towards these parties, oppositional parties have the incentive to provide more nuanced policies to get the same votes. Why is catering towards interests exclusive to your side?
So the first thing is that if the opposition parties are going to capture the new people who are previously left behind by this party, then you have like the same bad policies on your side, right? Because if these people were majoritarian and they voted for pro-ethnic policy, then the opposition party adopting pro-ethnic policy leads to the same outcome. So on their side, when one party gets removed, the small party grows big and they remove the next small party. So it's a continuous cycle of no one being able to have sustainable power. So on your side, it's a continuous cycle of instability and crisis when no one is able to hold on to power for longer? What is the weighing for this? The first is that this artificially engineered competition was a recipe for disaster, because what this means is that their claim on competition doesn't work because each party is never able to hold enough power to make effective policy changes. So if their claim was the merits of democracy wasn't our principle, but the outcome, they engineer more instability. But two, even if you believe that progress on our side was limited, it's far better than on their side when you generate an active harm and you leave parties in a worse off place than they previously were. That's when majoritarian parties can inflame those same nationalist sentiments that they identify by saying that the government and this committee attacked us, that's why we should be more radical, and they make things far worse. Third, on the economic prospects, we explain sustainable policies that outlast your individual rule, such as long-term infrastructure development that's exclusive when they can have long-term success, that they will be in power, which takes some of their worst possible grounds. We add another dimension of the debate, independent of politics, if you believe this is a wash. That is why on our side, we are able to support these long-term parties if they bring stability. That is why we vote Faroon.
Right, for that speech, off the flag, go ahead.
Democracies are democracies and not technocracies for a reason, right? Because core to a democracy is that it recognizes that there are a range of factors that contribute to what you believe to be your best representative, and to respect all of those factors regardless of whether or not you personally, or whether or not proposition personally, believes that to be a legitimate option. If the core of this debate was objectively good policies, then proposition would have you be anti-democratic, because a democracy never claims to create the objectively best option, so government's conflation between autonomy and good policies loses them this debate. Two things to talk about in this speech. Firstly, about the principles of democracy in two ways. One, we would remind you of First Proposition's own analysis in the very first speech, that they say that key to a healthy democracy is constant changes in power, which means that the implicit burden that Proposition imposes onto themselves is that they must prove a constant change in power in order for them to win this debate. Why is their inability to define a clear difference between political parties and dynasties harmful then? Which means that if the only thing they're doing is banning political dynasties, the resources exist, and I quote the second proposition's opening line, democracies are founded on resources. If resources stay symmetrical, if the kinds of influence and legacy and nostalgia that exist continues to persist under proposition, then they don't get the kinds of constant changes that lead to their healthy democracy. But here's where we differ in terms of burden. Proposition says a healthy democracy must come with constant changes in power. We say a healthy democracy comes with a strong judicial system that we're able to institute with our opposition fiat. We are able to have that mechanism. We're able to have that policy. We fulfill our own burden of the principles of democracy, which proposition still has no response to. They don't tell you about why on their side of the house uniquely that is the only pathway towards respecting democracy. And we tell you actually secondly that democracy is actually hampered on their side of the house. Why is this principle so important then? Because they were the team that told you about the impacts of political apathy. Political apathy is uniquely tied into the impacts of political accountability. There is no accountability if no one is going to the voting stations, as they tell you themselves. Why do they then hamper this kind of political participation? People only go to the voter booths if they believe themselves to be properly represented by the people in power. On opposition, we are not stopping the opposition parties from running. If you truly believe that the opposition party was the best option for you, go to the voting booth and take that number in your name. On opposition, we merely say that if they truly wanted the political dynasties, they can vote for them too. And it is this range of representation that actually makes political apathy decrease on our side, insofar as you're able to see somebody that represents you, even if it is in the form of a cult of personality. Their presidents voted in for the cult of personality. The Kennedys were voted in for their personality. It's unclear as to why proposition would only ban it in developing nations and not in the rest of the world too. Are they saying that these individuals are somehow incapable of recognizing their own worth? I think that's patronizing coming from proposition. But secondly, on the sustainability of these policies for these nations in two ways. One, we told you about the transparency of competition. If we take them at their best, that these political dynasties were so terrible individuals, or that they did have malevolent intentions, or they would simply violate any loophole in the system for their own interest, then the loopholes would exist either way. The difference is that we force them to compete within a strengthened, healthy, transparent democracy wherein any abuses are either called out, caught, or prosecuted. On their side, when they make things subjective, when they push things out outside of the system where people can see. They leave room for manipulation for the commission, for instance. This subjectivity makes it impossible for them to have accountability. But secondly, on how we get better policies, we told you about this economic development in two ways. One, that the establishment of these long-term legacies are actually beneficial insofar as you're able to institute sustainable policies that outlive your four-term election cycle. If Proposition wants constant changes in power, what they talk about is economic policies that only last for 4 years. You're talking about cash handouts, things to specifically buy votes and not actually establish the groundwork for a functioning country, especially in a developing nation. But secondly, we take proposition at their best. Let's say they want to constantly dismantle the system so you constantly have new people in place. That creates political gridlocks that makes it impossible for you to pass any policies meaningfully in time. If people are suffering and proposition wants to help them, you want to pass policies. Proposition would have you fight over the parliament and not actually get anything done. Oppose.
Alright, so for speech occupies and there is called proper life.
Alright, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition's case relies on one context and one context only, which is that these dominant political dynasties were always benevolent and that the policies that were passed were always in the interest of people, and that these dynasties were always that great for the country. The comparative are simple, right? Our case never relied on that context. Our win pathway was a healthy democracy, given that these political dynasties had a tendency in many countries to be malevolent, given that there were not sufficiently enough of check and balances against these against these political dynasties in many countries, like for example in South Africa. But we would much rather have constant change in power than have to defend a 60 years domination of these political dynasties. Their case only operated in one context. Our win pathway was simple. It didn't have to rely on it being malevolent. But secondly, right, I think given that they concede themselves that these political dynasties were so dominant to begin with and characterize them to be so good, I don't think they can claim any form of accountability structures to exist, given that people trust in them because of the nostalgia or whatsoever which they conceded. Secondly, which leads to no incentive to create good policies insofar as people believe in you whatever you do, given that there's no second thought as to what other options might be on the table. But third, it also accused us in the last speaker of an unclear setup. Panel, I think when we say limit, it was pretty clear from the get-go that we limit the airtime of these people. The opposition parties came into play to parliament, and there were people actually tabling better policies and actual better competition, right? If they had to live up to the past legacies of these so great dominant political dynasties, I think it was an incentive for them to come up with more nuanced policies, right? And if you feel that you were represented previously with the political dynasty, I think there will always be political actors to fill up that role to actually cater to those policies. But I think the difference was that they don't have the name and legacy of these political dynasties that entrench this bias that you had within you. You can actively, objectively evaluate these policies and actively come to a more informed decision and actually evaluate the policies of these parties, right? So first clash in democratic norms, right? I think proposition brought to you for a few things. Firstly, on competition. Secondly, on accountability, right? Opposition has not responded to the idea of corruption, and they said that, oh, we can hold these people accountable. But how probable is that, panel, when they are seen to be so entrenched within the power structures of these democracies, and they are so good to begin with, right? I think people are likely not going to have some form of optimism bias towards these kinds of people. But secondly, let's take the best case where the people who are in power under our side are rich millionaires, right? The difference is that they didn't have the legacy to rely rely upon. If they're bad, they're bad. They get elected out of power because people hate them. So on the second, so we think this is the main clash in this debate panel because democratic norms guarantee the future of like the 100 more years of your country. If for example, taking them at their best case, right, where these political entities are benevolent in status quo, they can't guarantee that in the future. Malevolent actors could come in, they could exploit like weak democratic systems. That was the winning clash panel. We guaranteed a healthy democratic system for 100 more years to come so that nothing can be exploited. That was the important thing. But on peer representation, right, panel, I think to claim a legitimate choice, options needed to precede a choice, right? If there's only one option for you to vote for this political dynasty, I think you're likely going to opt for it anyway, right? If I only knew about Starbucks and I didn't know how good coffee bean was. Okay, that's a very bad analogy. Yeah, I'm honestly going to go to Starbucks only, right? So we think that, and the idea of how people cannot be represented, I think there'll be more opposition parties that cater to them. And they also did not deal with the fact that people who are politically apathetic, especially among people who are not part of the race that these political dynasties represent. For example, like Chinese and Indians that are separate from Barisan National's interests, right? No engagement there, right? As to how they can actually get representation. They can actually vote for people under our side, the opposition parties coming in, right? So we tell you that under our worst case, like Umar said, hung parliament, we would rather take it to be like a decision that came to a consensus of multiple different actors rather than having no check and balances in your democracy and another 100 years of you and your entrenched power. Proud to propose.
Alright, thank you so much for that speech, Dr. Fly. With that, we have debate. Both teams please come to the House and the room. Since this is not round, the announcement is closed to the main. Thanks everyone.